This is the network of the cloth economy, which matches exactly the colonial routes, which means colonialism is alive and well. The textile trade historically has been the basis for the development of the modern world, beginning with the Silk Road in 114 BC by the Han Dynasty in China. The exchange of textiles throughout Asia, Persia, and the Mediterranean helped the formation of great civilizations that continue to inspire cultural traditions, philosophies, and lifestyles that we have now. The Silk Road is one of the earliest examples of a very successful textile economy where silk producers, spinners, dyers, and weavers contributed greatly to the economic success of all these areas. And so what we are going to look at today is how colonialism, being today an economic reality, is affecting the supply chain and is also contributing into this non-sustainable lifestyle that most organizations are affected by. On this panel, please welcome Benjamin Skinner, founder of Transparentem, Sam Raddochia, co-founder of Chronicled and Better Kinds, Anna Banks, Fairtrade USA, Chief Marketing Officer at Fairtrade USA, Cece Johnson, MBA Professor in Fashion and Innovation, and it is moderated by Lauren Fay, Fashion Revolution USA. Please give a warm round of applause.
Hi, I think this is on. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Celine, so much for organizing this incredible programming. I'm going to do a brief intro of myself and a fashion revolution, and then we're going to bring everybody out alphabetically to talk about this very meaty topic. So I am Lauren Fay. I'm the country coordinator and the executive director of Fashion Revolution USA. And Fashion Revolution, for those of you who don't know, is an international movement that extends to 90 countries internationally and is headquartered in London. It started when over 1,100 people were killed in 2013 when a factory collapsed in Bangladesh, and a group of women led by Ursula de Castro and Carrie Summers got together and staged a social media campaign to push for transparency in the supply chain. It began with a brilliant and simple idea, which is how most good ideas are, brilliant and simple. And they asked people to take selfies of their clothing inside out and to ask the brands, who made my clothes? What started as a day in memorandum of that fateful tragedy in Bangladesh has now, 4 years later, grown into one of the largest grassroots activist movements in the world. Fashion Revolution aims to educate the consumer on the importance of their purchasing power, their behaviors, and their influence over this huge industry that is fashion. Every year, HQ produces the Fashion Transparency Index, which you'll find on the website fashionrevolution.org. It's a tool that ranks 150 of the biggest global fashion and apparel brands and retailers, and according to how much information they disclose about their suppliers, their supply chain policies, and their social and environmental impact, it rates them. And we've been making progress year over year, but as of 2018, of the 150 brands surveyed, only 37 were reporting their suppliers. So our thinking at Fashion Revolution is that transparency equals accountability. And I think that's a really important part of this equation that we're going to be discussing on this panel this afternoon. So in order to put this into context, I want to touch on the magnitude of some of the human rights abuse issues that are still rampant in the system that makes our clothes. This context is key to understanding just why it's so important to unearth by whom and how our clothing is made. We live in a world where modern slavery is widespread. According to the Global Slavery Index of 2018, produced by the Walk Free Foundation, an estimated 40.3 million people, men, women, and children, were victims of modern slavery. Women and children make up over 70% of this group. And the International Labor Organization estimates that child labor affects 152 million internationally. And these women, or these children rather, are between the ages of 5 and 17, the majority of them being under the age of 14. One of the most important findings of the Global Slavery Index to highlight, I think, is that incidence of slavery in high GDP or, quote, developed countries is much higher than it was originally thought. This just goes to highlight that even in countries that have the strictest laws to prevent these kinds of abuses, there are gaps in the system that expose and make these people vulnerable. I had the honor to meet a woman named Flor Marina in New York a few months ago, who just recently was held against her will in Los Angeles as a slave. She now ultimately escaped and is championing against trafficking and doing survivor protection with the White House. But this story is just to highlight the stark reality that this is happening in our backyard, right here in this city. And we need to deploy all tools that we have to stop it. That includes new technology and local government, community groups, social media, and education, such as the knowledge that is spread through events like this. So I'm happy now to bring on to the stage our speakers. Celine did a bit of the introduction, so I'll just go ahead and bring them out by name, and then we will start with the questions. So we have Anna Banks from Fairtrade USA. We have Benjamin Skinner from Transparentem, Sam Raddochia from Chronicled, and Sissy Johnson, an MBA professor on innovation, culture, identity, and we'll talk a little bit more about what she does, as we will with everyone. So my first question is for Anna. Hi, Anna. Can you hear me? I was wondering if you could tell us how Fairtrade USA works.
Yeah, absolutely. So Fairtrade is actually celebrating its 20th year this year, and we are a not-for-profit with a market-driven approach to alleviating poverty. And what that means is we actually work with 70 countries around the world, including the United States, because we know there are often problems in our own backyard. And in those 70 countries, we actually work across a variety of products. The products that we work to certify, they include coffee, chocolate, cocoa, coconut, produce, seafood, and of course the reason that we're here, apparel and home goods. And I'll talk a little bit about how that apparel program works. So the first step is around the creation of standards. So the standards are against the International Labor Organization, and the standards are really kind of the gold standard for getting factories to a good place. And they can be against things that are very baseline, all the way to things that are sort of more nuanced and relevant for that particular factory. And by baseline, I mean things like no child labor, things around wages and working conditions. We've seen factories where workers work for 30 days straight with only 2 days off. We're really trying to evolve and work with the factory so there are regularly scheduled time off and then actually paid leave, so working towards 2 weeks of paid leave for workers there. We do things around health and safety are part of the standards that are created as well. So things like protective equipment when it's needed, handling of harmful chemicals. And there are also environmental regulations. We heard that beautiful presentation this morning around water. So the use of water and making sure water is not contaminated in the processes for the particular factory. So all of these are around the standard that is created, which can be 100 pages long, and be a process by which we work with the factory to bring them along. So the factory is assessed by where they stand along this particular standard, and we sort of work with them to create a plan to bring them forward. Now, another really critical piece of how fair trade works is something called the Fair Trade Committee. And this is where the empowerment piece makes a really huge difference for the factories that we work with. So every fair trade factory is required to set up a fair trade committee, which is a democratically elected body. So it's a group of peer elected folks at that particular factory, and they become the voice that then has a dialogue with management in that particular factory. They are also the body that determines how something called the Community Development Fund will be spent. So what is the Community Development Fund? That gets to that piece I mentioned, that we are a market-driven approach. So we work with brands and companies around the world, and they have to agree to buy their product on fair trade terms. And what that means is they agree to pay an incremental 1 to 10% over their export price, and that goes directly back to the workers who created that product. It actually even goes into a separate account and is set aside. And that Fair Trade Committee determines how that money will be spent via election. So they survey every single person in that factory, they do a needs assessment, and the community decides what is the best way to spend that money. And things that have come out of that have been things like child care center, health clinics, schools, transportation. So that next piece is a critical piece of it. So then I want to kind of go to the last piece of the puzzle, right? We've talked about the factory itself, how it goes on this journey of standards to assessment. We have brand partners who are agreeing to pay incremental money because it's all about getting more dollars into the pockets of workers. So the last piece in the puzzle is all of us, right? It's the consumer, because it's actually a pretty simple equation if we all think about it. So how much a worker gets paid is determined by, at least in large part, by how much the factory is getting paid for the product, right? How much the factory gets paid for the product is determined by how much the brand or company is willing to pay for that product. How much the company is willing to pay for that product is often dependent on how much we're willing to pay for that product. Right, so we get to vote with our dollars and show it's important to us that the product was made with high social standards, environmental standards, economic standards, so that we can be the ones that tie the piece back from what went into what we bought and eventually be able to power those workers to be able to have a living wage and be compensated fairly for the work that they do.
Great, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. And I have some intro questions really for everyone on the panel. For Samantha, I'm wondering if you can give, we'll tie this into the larger dialogue, but the layman's breakdown of blockchain for everyone here, because I think there's probably some people who would, the cliff notes would be helpful.
Yeah, okay, so hi, I'm Sam Raddochia. I'm a technologist, engineer, and activist, I guess, using technology, hopefully to bring transparency to supply chains, not just apparel supply chains, but global, pharmaceutical supply chains, precious metals, and things like that. Blockchain is not an easy thing to describe, but essentially it is a new sort of database, and anything that you record on it is agreed upon by distributed computers all around the world instead of people. Why is that important? Mainly, any information that you put onto it cannot be changed, can't be altered, deleted, obfuscated. So if you're thinking of a situation, let's talk about environmental sensors. There have been incidents where national governments are actually changing the information that is going into a database off of sensors to meet certain requirements. There are incidents happening in factories where audit reports are changed, and it's really, hard to determine what's accurate. So what we're working to do is to use this technology to record certain amounts of information, about a given product supply chain and its journey.
Great. Okay. And I'll move to Ben for your Transparentem. I know Celine gave a brief introduction, but if you could, in your own words, tell us a little bit about the goal of the work that you do at the nonprofit Transparentem.
Sure. Thanks very much, Lauren. In general, Transparentem is not a public-facing organization, so it's unusual that I'd be speaking publicly about what we do. But this is an exceptional conference, thanks to the organizers and thanks to all of you. We are a discrete nonprofit intelligence unit that uses frontline reporting ethics and forensic methods to understand where extreme social and environmental violations, crimes, degradation happen upstream in corporate supply chains. We are not industry agnostic for the moment. We're focused on fashion. We're focused on apparel, footwear, and accessories. And we use techniques and we adhere to relevant local laws but we operate completely independently because we are nonprofit. We serve the public, we're entirely philanthropically funded, and our delivery model is a little different from traditional journalism. I come out of a journalistic background. Many of the team that we've recruited are either intelligence professionals or come from the world of investigative journalism. And I think for those of us who've worked in journalism, one of the frustrations that we had was we would spend 9 months basically building out a bill of indictment against a company. And then we'd go to that company, and when I was working for Bloomberg, we would give 48 to 72 hours to the brand to respond to a really deep dive investigation into one or more of their suppliers before we went out over the Bloomberg terminals. And that would typically result in a defensive crouch. And many times there would be a cut and run response. They would cut the supplier. In other cases, they would lawyer up. In other cases, they would go to their PR teams. Transparentem is a tweak on that model. And what we do is we build out these very carefully constructed investigations that involve video evidence, that involve a written product, a detailed written product. And we give the brands and retailers an opportunity. We don't take money from them, we don't remediate, but we give them an opportunity to have a first crack at that information. And the way one of my early partners put it, we give them an opportunity to unfuck their supply chain before this goes into wider disclosure. And it does go into wider disclosure. So we go to their boards, eventually we go to their investors, we go to regulators, and we go to very carefully selected journalists. But when we go to them, we don't just go with the original information. We also say, okay, here's what they've done to fix the problem or not. And they don't have to do anything. But one way or another, we want them to be judged by the harsh light of day when it goes into that continuum of disclosure. And our basic message is pretty simple. You may not be interested in transparency, but transparency is interested in you.
I love that. And Sissy, in your work, you often focus on international storytelling and perception. How do you think we can change the narrative and the reporting on human rights issues in the media to better empower the exploited communities?
That's a tough one. Hi, everyone. First of all, I want to say thank you to the library for being here today and hosting such a great event. In regards to your question, from my perspective and experience, so I'm a professor, so most of my students actually come from former colonies, whether it's in Africa or Asia or Latin America. So I'll give you an example with students from African nations such as Congo, Nigeria, and so on. It's really about them changing their perspective on how they want to be seen and on the way they want the world to look at their countries, sorry. So initially when they come and study fashion in Paris, they come and they say, well, I want to stay here and work at Louis Vuitton. By the time they graduate, I brainwash them a little bit, and it's usually, I want to go back home and I want to start a magazine and I want to tell, stories with my own voice. And, we talk a lot about colonization, and one thing that I tell my students about is about decolonizing our voices, which I think is very important. It's not just the land, it's also the way you speak and the words the words you use to describe yourself, to describe your people, to describe where you're from. So, a lot of times, when I ask them to introduce themselves, they'll say, oh, I come from a third world country. And we start right there. So it's not even about changing the entire system. It's more on a micro level, how do you present yourself? And what is your self-perception? So For me, it's bigger than, academia or studying fashion. It's really about rebranding yourself, rebranding your nation, in order to foster change. So I'm more interested through teaching. I'm more interested about implementing change through individuals. And yes, Paris is glamorous, but I think it's also important to be reminded that where you're from is even more beautiful, because Paris has been branded as beautiful. It is a beautiful city, but a lot of things that you see in Paris are from Africa, for example, and a lot of people don't know it, So if you're coming to study fashion in France and you're looking at, the Louvre, right? And you see all these amazing, Egyptian artifacts. Well, guess what? It's where you're from. So it kind of changes your perspective. You're like, wait a minute, let me take credit for that. So a lot of, the exercises that I give my students are really about, writing opinion pieces, reading, of course, is very much essential, but again, how you write about yourself and where you're from is essential, to change your narrative, and using social media to carry that message and inspire others, ultimately.
Great. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, definitely. Everyone should, people should clap. I think that's, I think there's so much power in the individual. I mean, that's really, I think, why, everyone who's here has power to share this message, and particularly in that post-colonial lens, Anna and I were speaking about how there really aren't many countries that haven't been affected, by colonialism in one way or another. So having that perspective from either side of that dynamic is so important to reframe. So I have a question now that I'm going to ask the whole panel. So we'll start with Anna and then go down. So this is to just get sort of a landscape of the countries. I was wondering which countries you find it the hardest potentially to research and run investigations and operations with Fairtrade USA.
Yeah, so for us, it's less about running investigations. It is more about the operations and the ability to certify the actual farms and factories that have come to us. And I actually kind of want to touch on what Sissy just said about perception of self, because that actually does make a huge difference in our process. So one of the things that we have discovered, there are good and bad factories everywhere. But the places where it is particularly challenging for us are ones in which the concept of democracy and having your own voice and voicing to an authority is kind of foreign, are ones where we find most challenging to make progress. So often we work with Latin American countries, and democracy is a very much part of that culture, and it's not as challenging. But when you get to cultures that are, or societies that are either communist, or that idea of organizing is not even allowed. People are discouraged from gathering together and advocating for what is right for them. That is where we find we have trouble, because we start to work with folks and they're already in a place where their eyes are down to the floor when they are trying to converse with management. Our founder tells the story that was a huge aha for him, that when he set up a fair trade committee and was working with one of the cooperatives, and the moment the fair trade president had a conversation with one of their management and was looking them directly in the eye for the first time, he was like, oh my goodness, this is the difference. When people feel like they are empowered to be able to advocate for themselves. So that sort of democratic landscape is huge for us.
And Ben?
So I want to be a little circumspect, because we operate in a whole bunch of countries where our investigators are local, they're indigenous, and face threats. So without revealing too many countries that we're operating in by name, I would say countries and states within countries where there is a close nexus of power between powerful manufacturers and state actors are difficult ones for us to work in, because you can't rely on law enforcement to do their job in the way that you could in other places where there is a separation of powers there. Part of our model is predicated on the idea that The most powerful actors in the world today are multinational corporations increasingly. And you can say that's terrible, or you can say that's a fact and deal with it. What we find is that when we go to those brands and retailers and again give them that opportunity to do the right thing before the story comes out, before the bloom is off the rose, in general they will understand their leverage and use it. And so the story that really inspired this for me was one I did for Bloomberg for Business Week on the New Zealand fishing industry. And I chronicled slave labor on Korean foreign charter vessels operating in New Zealand's waters. And 3 months after that came out, New Zealand banned foreign charter vessels that were basically using a loophole to allow that slavery to take place on those vessels. It was one thing to do that in New Zealand, which prides itself on sort of labor rights and environmental cleanliness, et cetera, et cetera. Our first project for Transparentem, we looked at Bangladesh. And specifically, we were looking at the leather industry in Bangladesh. The leather industry for about 40 years was in a place called Hazarabad, where 90% of the leather coming out of Bangladesh was tanned. There wasn't a single effluent treatment plant in that residential neighborhood that had been overrun by those tanneries. And you had that very close matrix of powerful state actors, tannery owners, in some cases who were themselves parliamentarians, and basically no regulation. I would go into factories and it wasn't hard at all. I would bring out an SLR camera. I didn't do most of the investigation myself, but gives you a sense of the kind of impunity they are operating with. Bring out an SLR camera and take pictures of 8-year-olds working with chrome to tan this leather. Basically, we went to the brands and retailers. We said, your manufacturers are using this leather. What are you going to do about it? Within 2 weeks of disclosure, the government of Bangladesh had gone in and completely shut down Hazarabad and stood up a new tannery estate in an industrial park with a yet to be fully operational, but a central effluent treatment plant that is going, and we will continue to watch.
And Sam, for blockchain, I guess for
Yeah, I mean, so we're in many different industries as well. So, I mean, over the past 8 years, I've been very deeply involved in multiple supply chains, and a company will come to us and say, hey, we want to be able to track this pair of jeans or this shoe or this pharmaceutical drug from the source, and be able to prove to our regulators or prove to Fairtrade or prove to our customer X, Y, and Z that it was sustainably sourced or that it was ethically made. Now, that's incredibly complicated, as we all on this panel know, and these networks are so complex with often thousands of participants, and oftentimes ones that the brands or manufacturers don't even know who they're sourcing from because it's so complex. So those were the main kind of goals of Chronicled. Recently, I got kind of sick of just seeing these networks and seeing all of the challenges in them. For example, I was doing some work in the cosmetics industry, and for those of you that don't know, glitter is from mica, which is 80% of how this is mined is using child labor, and it's in auto paint. It's in quite a few things. And so as I was on the ground in India, and this was a very challenging space for us, it wasn't the government, it wasn't the local authorities, it was the people themselves. It was the parents who actually had been paid by the mines to send their children to work there because they needed the money. Seeing this was incredibly disheartening, because here I was, I'm there mainly just to onboard these people so we can trace the ethically sourced mica, or you can imagine if it's cobalt or any other ethically sourced commodity, and that just wasn't enough. So that led me to co-found my recent company, Better Kinds, which is focused on not only certifying or ranking or tracing or mapping supply chains or making them more efficient, but celebrating those who are making efforts to do better and rewarding them. So in a similar way to the fair trade model, taking some of that spread and paying it back to the individuals who are working at the source in every point within, and doing that using the technology. So again, but blockchain, the technology, it's not going to fix all the world's problems. And a lot of people will get up here and promote that. It can fix some problems. It can also be very dangerous, and it can instill, if the system itself is fundamentally flawed, it's going to keep those people in power, and that's, I can't stand by and let that happen either. So it's important that we use our tools, our investigations, our technologies, and our brain power, our collective abilities as human beings to create new systems and models as well. So that's what I've been working on, and yeah, I think that was just one example of one country where that's a story to show that sometimes it's not even the structural problems, it's the people themselves that are, embedded and believe this is the only way to make an income.
Yeah. And so it's a good transition with sort of a cultural thread, maybe, for you to...
All right. So I would say that in terms of fashion and luxury, Africa is kind of the next frontier. It's also the youngest continent in the world. And so everybody has their eyes on Africa right now. But the mistake that I tend to see a lot from companies is to address Africa as a country, which is why I really love this meme on social media that says Africa is not a country. It really isn't a country. And so they tend to have this approach of, we're going to tap into the African market. And my thing is, there's no such thing as an African market. Everything about Africa, from people to languages, and not dialects, languages and so on, is multiple. And there are nuances, on the continent. There are nuances inside, one country. So it's extremely complex for a lot of companies to tap into the continent, even though they may express some kind of interest, in terms of business. So I'll give you an example I got from a friend of mine. She's from Nigeria, and she said, Sissy, this place is very big, okay? Nigeria is so big that somebody from the north won't understand somebody from down south. That's how big Nigeria is. So as a brand, you cannot tap into the Nigerian market. You have to go by region and be very specific about your product offering, because you have, multiple religion, multiple ethnic groups, even though I don't like the term. So it's really important for companies precisely from the West to invest into cultural awareness, and this kind of training I don't see enough in business. I think it's essential, and if you don't know as a company, reach to someone from that community to teach you. What is a big problem for me is when companies just assume, because they're so big and so fabulous and so successful elsewhere, that they can just approach any other market the same, specifically so-called emerging markets. And I like to say that specifically in regards to Africa, people on the continent are so unimpressed right now. A few years ago, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, still, people would be like, oh my gosh, you can't afford Chanel. Oh my gosh, you can't afford the Burberry. But now it's like, I can get a visa and go to Paris and get, a pair of Chanel shoes if I want to. So what else, can you bring to the table? Are you willing to learn about my culture and either co-brand with someone, locally, or find some other ways for us to collaborate and do something respectful? So cultural appreciation, right? And meaningful and impactful. Otherwise, people are just not interested at this point to keep going with that same narrative of we're coming to help you. It's very problematic to look at any place, that way. In the case of the continent, the internet, has done wonder as far as empowering people in terms of the way they're looking at themselves. So it's essential that, as a designer, as a brand, as a journalist, you keep that in mind when you cover, former colonies. It's super important.
So And I'm going to keep the line system here for Anna. I wanted to ask, how can Fairtrade USA use its influence and its network to support, you were mentioning freedom of association and how that's prevented in some societies, and also workers' cooperatives and other grassroots groups, so that they can, maybe liaise and work with local government?
Yeah, so I actually want to focus on kind of the empowerment piece for workers overall, because part of the standard is around making sure that workers have some mechanism to voice grievances, and that's something that might not have existed otherwise. And this is huge in factories, right, where you have incidents of sexual harassment, and there is no recourse for women to address that. And this allows them to have a mechanism for that. So I think that's a really huge piece of the empowerment side. The other one I talked about was the Fair Trade Committee. And that Fair Trade Committee is that organizing body. So this often is for the first time that these workers have been involved in democratically electing someone who is a voice for them. And that voice can have a dialogue, with their management, but more importantly, it's managing a fund. Like, this is huge that, this community may be bringing in more dollars than they have ever seen, and they need to understand how to manage it, how are we going to spend it, how are we going to make sure we can, pay it forward to be something valuable for our community. And the way that it is spent, every person in that community has to have a voice. So every worker is surveyed to understand what the needs are for that community in order to determine how those dollars will be spent. So that is a really huge piece in everyone feeling like they are part of sort of the uplifting of that community. Because we often, Cece, I'm looking at you again, because this idea of cultural bias, if we were to try to tell them how they should spend that money, the things that we would come up with would be completely different. There are often things that I have heard that the dollars have been spent against that I've kind of gone, wow, why would they pick that? So, for example, I just went to visit a factory in Mexico, and they chose to spend their dollars against a soccer field. And I would think, soccer field? What's the big deal with a soccer field? No. This is huge, because when workers are getting off at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they're going straight to that soccer field. They're playing for several hours, because the alternative before was, guess where they were going? To the bar. And so now it has become this community rallying space where whole families come, and there are multiple teams that are playing. Like, this has kind of changed the dynamic of that community against a soccer field. I never would have figured that out, but this community knew that that was something that would change for them. So allowing them to unleash their own voice has been really huge. So.
That's great. Yeah, actually, I feel like we are definitely one of the countries that doesn't get soccer, really. So I know internationally what a big deal it is. And so for Ben, I want to ask, for Transparentem, how do you ultimately see yourself working with potentially these corporations and governments to help implement some of the needed changes that you are exposing?
We pride ourselves on independence, and I think that's really important if we are going to conduct truly effective investigations and have a leveraged conversation with what would otherwise be a fairly asymmetric conference table. When we sit down with the brands and the retailers, we're sitting down with entities that have, in some cases, control, tens of millions of dollars of spend, and that affects the lives of tens of thousands of people. We have we try to appeal to a common sense of purpose, which is, we're not trying to take a blowtorch to the apparel industry. What we're trying to do, in fact, we've been accused by some of these brands in early sit-downs of saying, "Oh, you're trying to stop us from sourcing from the developing world." It's not that at all. We understand that for millions of people, the apparel industry is the first step on the ladder out of absolute poverty. What we're trying to do is making sure that that is a safe step, and making sure that there is that they are given adequate human rights, that they are given adequate environmental rights, that their water is not destroyed, going back to this morning's conversation in the process, that their health is not destroyed. And our role in that is to shine a light where we feel that things have gone awry. For the most part, what we find is that the brands and the retailers tend to sit down with us, for the most part, with a sense of initial trepidation, like who are these people, what are they going to do with this information. There's a lot of lawyers involved, but after the lawyers kind of do their work and they understand, okay, we do have a common goal here, which is, sure, on their part, it's protect their brand. We don't really care about that so much. We care about making sure that the workers are protected. But those two things come together at the end of the day. And what we've seen over and over again, and I think increasingly, is there's a real impetus when you do good investigation that is unassailable, that can't be punctured with a lawsuit and can't be washed away with PR. There's a real impetus there for system change, and that's what we aim for.
Well, that's what's needed. So, and so, Sam, I want to ask if you, in your basically the best scenario for blockchain as a tool for potentially empowerment and changing the system, how do you personally see that particularly within the fashion industry, potential within?
I mean, really, like any system, blockchain doesn't stand alone on its own, so it works at the convergence of many different technologies like additive manufacturing and Internet of Things or sensors or just people. I mean, the technology was created to democratize access to financial capital. Like that's what Bitcoin, which is the original blockchain, the Bitcoin blockchain was created so that currencies could transcend national boundaries. So if we look at like the general ethos of the technology, my hope would be that it would do that. It could democratize access to capital for companies that are, doing the right thing or making efforts towards human rights or sustainability. I don't see it as a tool that should be used for control or policing or that level of tracking. But, again, my hope would be like if you are a company, and let's say, for example, in the denim industry, and to go on the topic of water and the pollution of water, number 2 polluters of water in the world, this industry, those of us here that are making efforts not to do that, then let's use the technology to amplify that message. So amplify the voices of those that are making efforts to do better as opposed to point fingers or use it to track. And of course, all of that information will start to fall out from the bottom because if, let's say, you're a denim mill and you're tracking, the water quality with a sensor that comes out of your production line, and that information is just, pinging, being registered to this blockchain. And that could be verified by anyone, including the consumer who buys it. Eventually, those who are not making those efforts are going to fall out. It'll become very clear by having that information. So yeah, my hope would be to see it democratizing access to information.
Great. And Sissy, can you give me an example of a former colonized country that has taken a stand again in regards to sustainability in the supply chain?
Yes. So is anybody familiar with Rwanda? Have you heard of it? Can you raise your hand if you have? Okay. Where is Rwanda on the map? West Africa? East Africa? East Africa. Okay. So Rwanda is a tiny East African country And the way we've heard about Rwanda through the years was really because of the genocide that took place, a few decades ago. And for the longest time, that was the narrative about Rwanda. Like whenever you'll say, the country's name, that's the first thing that will come to your mind. And a few years ago, I was working with a jeweler, an African jeweler from Nigeria who produces in Rwanda. And we had this encounter with the ambassador of Rwanda in France, and he told us that in order for them to change the narrative of the country, they had to do everything different. And he shared a word with us, and he said, we call it agachure, and agachure means dignity, right? So right now you know us as this terrible place where, thousands and thousands of people died, but in order for us to change that narrative, we have to change the government, number one. And now, if you look at the government of Rwanda, most of the people in government are women. So ultimately, that changes a lot of things, right? Because we tend to do things different. And in terms of policies, that the country is implementing in regards to sustainability, the country of Rwanda has recently actually took a stand against the U.S. and secondhand clothing. They decided that, they didn't want our old clothes, right? And as a clapback, the Trump's, administration has decided to suspend, their right to import duty-free clothing to the U.S. So that's definitely a first for Africa to be so vocal when it comes to sustainability and saying, no, we don't want that because we want to develop our local creative and textile industries. So that's the most recent news in regards to, sustainable fashion for an African country. And I think it's major and it needs to be, discussed more. And as a result of this decision from Rwanda, the government was able to create over 1,400 jobs, So I think it's essential that we acknowledge these milestones and, talk about these regions and this country and these people differently, because there's so much happening on the continent right now that we're not discussing. And long term, I hope, not even long term, mid-term, I hope that, we will no longer focus on, war and genocide and so on, because if you look at Africa as a whole, there's so much happening in the tech space in particular. Actually, Rwanda has one of the fastest ecosystem in Africa when it comes to tech, just like Kenya, and that's part of, rebranding Africa and owning the narrative and changing the narrative of, 54 countries. That's
right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that touches on what you were saying earlier about taking the power back and in both the individual and also the industry and ultimately the government as well. So I am going to, I'm trying to look at the clock. I can't see the timing, but I think we have time for one question for everybody. One quick question. I just want to kind of hear in your own words from you what you think that your work is doing to empower people. So it's sort of off of what Sissy was saying.
Yeah, so I've talked about the Fairtrade Committee, but I actually want to flip it. I think my job is to empower everybody in the room, right? To empower the consumer to realize you can vote with your wallet by making a choice around what you pick, whether it's a couple more cents for your coffee or a few more dollars for your t-shirt, like telling brands that these issues matter to you in what you purchase. It's resulted in an incremental $500 million going back into the pockets of workers around the world for fair trade. We hope that becomes $1 billion by the time we get to 2022. But that's kind of a huge piece of it. I want to say that
that's a huge metric. I didn't realize that was your number.
That's great. It's not a small metric. So.
No, that's great.
I think, in addition to empowering the consumer, our feedstock is largely what we hear from the workers and what we hear from the communities around production, and allowing them to, in a sense, speak directly to the brands, whether or not their direct employers want them to, is something that I think I find very moving at the end of the day. To go in front of a C-suite executive at a brand and say, hey, this individual was employed in one of your suppliers. This individual's life has been destroyed as a result of that employment and as a result of losing all of his money to a parasitic recruiter who took his salary. It's empowering for me personally, and it's an honor to do the work. It's satisfying when at the end of the day, that individual sees a bit of justice.
Tough acts to follow. I mean, yeah, along the lines of empowerment, so a lot of, again, the work that I've done and what we're discussing up here are supply chains. This is inherently ingrained with colonialism, and as much as we can make them more efficient or more ethical or more sustainable, fundamentally it's my opinion that we need to move to a new model, which I've called demand chains. So, producing things as needed, consuming more responsibly, and empowering local communities to do that. So along the lines of what you were saying, not having things being sent all over the world, but if a local community wants to build an economic infrastructure or with the tools of 3D printing, 3D knitting, new paths for materials to be made and sent around, I think really that's what I'm super excited about with all of these new technologies that we have and how they can impact local communities.
All right, so I'll say that in regards to my work within academia, it's really about creating new programs that you normally wouldn't find at fashion schools. So one of the latest one that I co-developed is African gastronomy. It's actually an MBA course in Paris, and it's part of a luxury brand management program. So a lot of people told me, but what does that have to do with luxury? Why gastronomy at a fashion school? And I'm like, why not, right? Because it's part of, it's part of changing the narrative. So when you think of luxury, you never really think of Africa, but Africa powers, the fine jewelry industry when you think about it. So if you think of Paris and Place Vendôme is the fancy place in Paris where you have all the jewelers, right? And I like to call it the most African place in Paris. Like Place Vendôme is low-key Africa, So for me, luxury is part, of African cultures, is actually embedded, So for me to be able to have a space to have this kind of, conversations with my students and allow to have a place where I can, design those programs is really empowering to me, and I believe to others also.
Great, thank you. I think you all are doing amazing, amazing work. It's been an honor to talk with you, and I'm going to now turn it over to Celine's panel. As she was saying, the trade routes are mostly the same as they were 150 years ago, so we're going to be talking a little bit about, this broken system and how to solve it. So, thank you, everybody.